tied by cruel hands for failing to fulfill one expectation, bearing a child. The black woman's suffering went unseen until the mountain man discovered her bonds and set her free. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The winter wind cut through Mary Johnson's thin dress like a knife, her dark skin raw and chapped after 3 days of exposure. The old oak tree in Willow Creek's town square stood as her unwilling companion, its rough bark scraping against her back whenever she shifted her weight to ease the burning in her shoulders. The iron shackles binding her wrists and ankles had long since numbed her extremities, though the physical pain paled in comparison to the humiliation that burned within her chest. Townsfolk hurried past, their footsteps quickening as they approached the square, and as some whispered behind cupped hands, others simply averted their eyes, but all carried the same unspoken message. This was justice. Mary's crime, her body's refusal to bear a child during 5 years of marriage, was considered failure enough to warrant this public display of shame. "Water," she croaked, her voice barely audible after days of exposure. A young boy paused, uncertainty flickering across his face before his mother yanked him away with a harsh whisper about that barren woman. Robert Davis, her former husband, passed by shortly before noon, his tall figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the pale winter sun. The man who had once sworn to love her forever now regarded her with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the metal binding her limbs. He paused briefly, adjusting the collar of his coat against the chill. "You brought this on yourself," he said, voice steady and emotionless. "The town has its traditions for a reason." Mary said nothing, saving what little strength remained. She had learned during their marriage that words were useless against Robert's conviction that a wife's primary duty was to provide children. His disappointment had turned to resentment, then to cruelty, and finally to this public humiliation sanctioned by Willow Creek's unwritten law. An elderly woman shuffled past, making the sign of the cross. "Punishment fits," she muttered. "Can't be a proper wife if you can't bear children." The square emptied as evening approached, leaving Mary alone with her thoughts and the distant howl of wind through the mountains that surrounded the isolated town. Those mountains had always represented freedom to her, a wild place beyond the reach of Willow Creek's suffocating tradition. Now they seemed impossibly far away, a dream as unattainable as the acceptance she had once craved. Night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Mary closed her eyes, wondering if she would survive until morning, wondering if anyone would care if she didn't. The judgment of Willow Creek was absolute, and in their eyes a woman who couldn't fulfill her purpose deserved nothing but scorn. By dusk on the 3rd day, Mary Johnson's strength was failing her. The biting wind had chafed her exposed skin raw, and the metal of her shackles had long since numbed her wrists and ankles. Her vision blurred, the faces of Willow Creek's residents melting into a hazy sea of judgment as they passed. Their jeers had gradually faded to murmurs of boredom, her suffering no longer novel entertainment. Only the bitter taste of shame kept her conscious. That, and a desperate flickering hope that someone might see her as more than her supposed failure. 3 days bound to the old oak in the square had stripped away everything except this primal need to be recognized as human. Robert Davis, her former husband, had walked past twice that day, his cold eyes sliding over her as if she were nothing but a disappointing piece of furniture he'd discarded. Each time the weight of his disdain pressed against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The town had followed his lead, their collective judgment absolute. Couldn't even do what a woman's made for. She'd heard one of the older women whisper to another as they passed, not bothering to lower their voices enough. As the sun began its final descent behind the distant hills, Mary's head drooped forward. Her parched lips formed silent words, not prayers, for she had abandoned those, but a promise to herself that if she survived this, she would never again allow herself to be measured by her ability to bear children. The sudden sound of hoofbeats cut through the evening quiet. Steady and unhurried, they echoed down the dirt road leading into town. Mary forced her head up, blinking away the fog of exhaustion as every gaze in the square turned toward the approaching figure. The silhouette appeared first, a man on horseback, his broad shoulders set against the dying sun. As he drew closer, murmurs rippled through the gathered townsfolk. "The mountain man," someone whispered, the words carrying on the still air, John Brown rode into the square with the easy confidence of someone who rarely sought company but feared no man. His weathered face revealed nothing as his eyes swept over the scene, taking in Mary's bound form with a steady gaze. The horse beneath him, a sturdy bay, snorted and pawed at the ground as if sensing the tension. The mountain man's shadow stretched long and defiant across the packed dirt, reaching toward Mary like an outstretched hand. For the first time in 3 days, something other than shame flickered in her heart, a dangerous, fragile thing that felt almost like hope. John Brown's weathered face hardened as he took in the cruel spectacle before him. His eyes, accustomed to the solitude of mountain landscapes, narrowed at the sight of Mary Johnson bound to the oak tree, her dignity stripped away by the town's judgment. The muscles in his jaw tightened with a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel during his years of isolation. Without uttering a single word, the mountain man dismounted from his horse in one fluid motion. The gathered townsfolk fell silent, their earlier jeers dying in their throats as they recognized the solitary figure who rarely ventured into Willow Creek. John's reputation preceded him, a man who chose the wilderness over human company, whose strength was whispered about in hushed tones around evening fires. He reached for the hunting knife secured at his belt, the blade glinting in the fading sunlight. With deliberate movements he approached Mary, whose head hung low from exhaustion and shame. The crowd shifted nervously, but no one dared intervene as he sliced through the ropes binding her wrists to the oak. "You can't do that," a voice finally called out Robert Davis, stepping forward with false bravado. "She's being punished according to our ways." John didn't even acknowledge Mary's former husband. His silence carried more weight than any shouted threat could have. He continued cutting through the shackles at her ankles, each rope falling away like the severing of an unjust sentence. The townsfolk murmured their outrage, but kept their distance. Even in their collective strength, something about the mountain man's quiet determination made them hesitate. Perhaps it was the way he moved with purpose, or the hardness in his eyes that spoke of a man unafraid of consequences. Mary swayed as the last restraint fell away, her legs buckling after days of forced standing. John caught her before she could collapse, his calloused hands gentle despite their strength. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her exhausted body against his chest. Her parched lips moved, attempting words of gratitude, but he shook his head slightly. No thanks were necessary for basic human decency. With the same efficient movements, he carried her to his waiting horse and carefully settled her onto the saddle. The animal remained steady, sensing its rider's calm command despite the tension in the air. John glanced once more at the gathered crowd, his gaze sweeping over their faces, some angry, some ashamed, some simply confused by this disruption to their cruel tradition. Then, taking the reins, he led his horse away from the town square, Mary Johnson secured on its back, the first steps of her unexpected journey toward freedom. Mary Johnson's body trembled uncontrollably, her muscles weak from days of exposure and humiliation. The gentle sway of the horse beneath her threatened to lull her into unconsciousness, but the unfamiliar warmth of John's strong arms around her kept her tethered reality. After 72 hours bound to that old oak in the town square, human touch that wasn't meant to harm felt almost foreign. "You're not theirs to punish. You're free now," John whispered, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the fog of her exhaustion. The mountain man's words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of a revelation. Free. The concept seemed impossible after what she'd endured. Mary's cracked lips parted to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. John reached for a small canteen tied to the saddle, bringing it carefully to her mouth. The cool water, sliding down her throat, felt like life itself returning to her body. "Small sips," he cautioned, his weathered face showing concern but no pity. This distinction alone made tears well in her eyes. As they rode higher into the hills, Mary gathered enough strength to glance back at Willow Creek. The town that had once been her home now looked small and insignificant from this distance. Yet the memory of Robert's cold eyes as he'd walked past her day after day, refusing to acknowledge her humanity, still burned fresh in her mind. Her former husband had been the first to suggest the public shaming when she failed to conceive after 3 years of marriage. The shame clung to her like a second skin, impossible to shed, despite the increasing distance between her and the town. Would she ever feel clean again? Would she ever look at herself without seeing the failure they had branded her to be? The mountain air helps clear the mind, John offered, as if sensing her thoughts. Up here, the only judgment that matters is whether you can survive the winter. Mary nodded weakly, her head resting against his chest as the horse navigated the winding trail. The steady rhythm of John's heartbeat provided an anchor as her consciousness began to drift. "I don't even know why you helped me," she managed to whisper. John was silent for so long that Mary thought he hadn't heard her. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible above the sound of the horse's hooves on the rocky path. "Because no one helped someone I once cared about," he said. "And I've lived with that every day since." As darkness fell around them, Mary surrendered to exhaustion, slipping into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days. In her dreams the chains fell away, one by one. The mountain air was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of Willow Creek. Mary Johnson breathed deeply as John Brown guided her along winding trails that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Her legs trembled with each step, still weak from days of being bound to the oak tree. But something about the crisp air filled her lungs with newfound strength. "Not much farther," John said, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles. The mountain man moved with the confidence of someone who knew every root and stone of this place, occasionally glancing back to ensure Mary could keep pace. When they finally reached the clearing, she saw it, a modest cabin nestled among towering pines, smoke curling from a stone chimney. It wasn't much to look at, with its weathered logs and simple porch, but to Mary it represented something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. Inside, the world seemed to shrink to essential elements: the crackle of firewood, the rustle of wind in the leaves, the soft glow of lantern light against rough-hewn walls. No judging eyes, no whispers, no shame. "You can have the bed," he said, gesturing to a simple frame covered with furs and blankets. "I'll take the floor." Mary nodded, unable to form words of gratitude through her exhaustion. John seemed to understand, giving her space, speaking little, but his watchful eyes remained attentive to her needs. The following days brought simple lessons in survival. He showed her how to arrange kindling and logs to light a proper fire, his calloused hands demonstrating with practiced efficiency. "The flame needs to breathe," he explained, arranging small sticks in a careful pattern, just like people. She learned how to boil water from the nearby stream, how to identify edible roots among the undergrowth, and how to listen for approaching footsteps in the forest. Each skill was a small victory, a step towards self-reliance. "Why are you helping?" Mary finally asked on the third evening, her voice stronger than it had been since her rescue. The mountain man paused, staring into the dancing flames. "Everyone deserves a chance to live without chains," he said simply. In this remote cabin, Mary discovered a new world, one where her worth wasn't measured by her ability to bear children or please a husband. Here, survival depended on her own hands, her own mind, her own strength. For the first time since Robert had denounced her to the town, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. The bruises on Mary Johnson's wrists faded from angry purple to dull yellow, healing faster than she had dared to hope. Each morning she traced the marks with her fingertips, watching them disappear like the memories of Willow Creek she tried desperately to forget. Her body recovered, but the invisible wounds, the ones that made her flinch at sudden movements or wake gasping in the night, those would take longer. John noticed but never commented, instead teaching her through quiet example. "The mountain provides if you know how to ask," he would say, demonstrating how to coax fire from damp wood or find water trapped in certain leaves after rainfall. Mary watched his weathered hands work with practiced efficiency, then tried herself, failing often, but improving daily. "I've never been good with my hands," she admitted one evening after dropping a third pot of water. "That's because no one let you try," John replied simply, helping her refill it without judgment. The cabin became a classroom where Mary learned to exist without permission. She discovered the satisfaction of splitting wood, the muscles in her arms growing firmer with each swing of the axe. She learned to identify which mushrooms were safe to eat and which berries would make a tea to ease her still frequent headaches. As spring arrived, the mountain transformed. Snow retreated up the slopes, and green shoots pushed through dark soil. Mary found herself mirroring this renewal, standing taller each day, her voice growing stronger when she spoke. She no longer huddled by the fire but ventured out alone, exploring the trails around the cabin, memorizing landmarks, and finding favorite spots to sit and listen to the wild. "You're getting mountain legs, John," observed one afternoon when she returned from gathering herbs without getting lost. Mary smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on her face. "It feels like the mountain accepts me," she said. "Mountains don't judge," he responded. "They just are." That simple truth became her foundation. Here, no one measured her worth by her ability to bear children. No one whispered when she passed, or averted their eyes as if her supposed failure might be contagious. The wind didn't care about her past, and the trees didn't demand she conform to their expectations. For the first time since Robert had denounced her in front of the entire town, Mary began to breathe without the weight of shame crushing her chest. The mountain became more than a hiding place. It became her sanctuary, a realm where she could exist without apology, where her value wasn't determined by anyone else's standards. Each night, as darkness wrapped around the cabin, Mary would step outside and look toward the distant lights of Willow Creek, feeling both the pull of her past and the promise of something entirely her own. Despite the warmth of the cabin, Mary Johnson found herself shivering as darkness settled over the mountain. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls, but they only seemed to mimic the ghosts that haunted her thought. Each night brought the same unwelcome visitors, memories of Willow Creek that refused to stay buried. She stared into the flames, her fingers absently tracing the fading marks on her wrists where the ropes had cut deep. The angry faces of her former neighbors appeared in the fire, their eyes filled with judgment, mouths twisted in disgust. The whispered slurs echoed in her mind: barren, worthless, failure. Most painful was the memory of Robert's cold stare as he had turned his back on her in the town square, declaring her unfit to be his wife because she couldn't give him children. "The fire needs more wood," John said, interrupting her thoughts as he placed another log on the flames. The mountain man moved with quiet efficiency, his actions deliberate and careful. He settled across from her, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. Mary pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think they were right about me?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. John's eyes met hers, steady and clear. "You don't owe them anything," he said simply. "Not your body, not children, not your worth." The words hung in the air between them, plain yet profound. Mary let them sink in, feeling something shift inside her, the first brick in a wall she needed to build to protect herself from the past. "I tried for years," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Robert blamed me entirely. The town followed his lead." John nodded, understanding in his silence. He reached for his wooden cup, taking a slow sip of water before speaking again. "People fear what they don't understand. They make rules to control that fear, and punish those who break them," Mary added. "Yes," he agreed. "But up here, there are different rules. The mountain doesn't care if you have children. It only asks that you respect its ways." Mary watched as embers floated upward from the fire, brief and bright against the darkness. For the first time she considered that perhaps her value wasn't tied to what her body could or couldn't do. The thought was fragile, but it glowed like those embers, a small light against the crushing weight of everything she'd been taught. That night, when the nightmares came, they seemed less powerful than before. John's words had given her something to hold on to, a foundation upon which she might, slowly, rebuild herself. One evening, as twilight painted the cabin in soft shadows, Mary Johnson moved methodically across the wooden floor, her broom sweeping away the day's dust. The rhythmic motion had become therapeutic over the weeks, a simple task that required nothing but her own strength. As she reached the corner near John's sleeping area, the floorboard beneath her feet gave a peculiar creak, different from its usual complaint. Curiosity piqued. She knelt down, her fingers finding the edge of a loose plank. With gentle pressure, the weathered wood lifted, revealing a small hollow space beneath. Nestled in the darkness was a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time and handling. Mary hesitated, her conscience battling her curiosity. This was John's private space, his sanctuary. Yet something about the hidden nature of the box, drew her hands forward. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded from years of use. When she carefully opened it, pages of meticulous handwriting revealed themselves, not the practical notes on hunting or gathering she might have expected from the mountain man, but raw confessions of a heart once shattered. The entries told a story that made Mary's breath catch. John wrote of Sarah Miller, a woman he had loved with quiet devotion. Like Mary, Sarah had been judged harshly by her community, deemed unworthy for reasons beyond her control. The town had broken her spirit piece by piece, until nothing remained of the woman John had cherished. "I couldn't save her," one entry read. The ink blotched as if tears had fallen while the words were written. "They took everything from her until she believed she was nothing. I was too late." Mary's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. The parallels to her own story were unmistakable. The judgment, the shame, the crushing weight of others' expectations. But where Sarah's story had ended in tragedy, Mary's had found an unexpected turn when John appeared at the oak tree. She understood then why he had cut her bonds that day in Willow Creek. In saving her, he was attempting to heal his own past failure. Each lesson in survival he taught her was not just about living in the wilderness, but about reclaiming what others had tried to take. Mary carefully returned the journal to its hiding place, replacing the floorboard exactly as she had found it. When John returned later with firewood, she looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just her rescuer, but a man carrying his own scars, fighting his own battles with the ghosts of the past. Their stories were now intertwined, bound together by shared pain and the quiet hope of healing. Mary closed the weathered journal, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. The weight of John Brown's words settled in her chest, each entry a testament to a pain that mirrored her own. The mountain man's rescue hadn't been a random act of mercy. It had been born from the ashes of his own tragedy. "Sarah Miller," she whispered, the name hanging in the cabin's still air. The woman John had loved, broken by judgment and cruelty, just as Mary had been in Willow Creek. She could almost see Sarah's face in the flickering shadows cast by the fireplace. Another woman deemed unworthy by those who claimed the right to judge. Mary rose from her seat by the window, clutching the journal to her chest. Outside, John was chopping wood, his rhythmic movements a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She watched him through the glass, seeing him differently now, not just as her rescuer, but as a fellow traveler on a path marked by rejection and resilience. When he came inside, brushing pine needles from his shoulders, Mary didn't hide the journal. Instead, she placed it on the table between them, a silent acknowledgement of boundaries crossed and secrets discovered. "I found it," she said simply. "I understand now." John's eyes flickered to the journal, then back to her face. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken recognition. "Sarah was," he began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You don't have to tell me," Mary assured him. "Your words in there told me enough." He nodded, grateful for the mercy of not having to speak the pain aloud. Instead, he stoked the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "What happened to me in town," Mary said carefully. "It happened to her too, didn't it? Different place, different people, but the same cruelty." "Yes," John replied, his voice rough with memory. "And I couldn't save her." Mary understood then, his rescue of her wasn't just kindness. It was redemption, a chance to heal wounds that time alone couldn't close. In saving her, he had found a way to honor Sarah's memory, to fight a battle he had once lost. As darkness settled over the mountain, Mary felt a quiet sense of kinship with both the man across from her and the woman who lived only in his memories. They were all survivors, their scars different but their need for freedom the same. The cabin, once just a shelter, now felt like something more, a sanctuary where broken people could begin to rebuild themselves, piece by careful piece. The peace of the mountain couldn't last forever. On a particularly brisk morning when frost still clung to the pine needles and Mary Johnson's breath formed small clouds in the air, unfamiliar voices shattered the tranquility of their sanctuary. She froze while gathering kindling, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sounds grew closer. "Here," she whispered, dropping the wood and rushing back to the cabin. John Brown was already standing on the porch, his weathered face set in grim determination. He'd known this day would come eventually. The mountain had ears, and word of Mary's new life had surely reached Willow Creek. "Stay inside," he instructed, his voice gentle but firm. "This is between me and them." Through the cabin window, Mary watched as 5 men emerged from the tree line. Robert Davis led the group, his familiar stride making her stomach twist with remembered pain. Her ex-husband's face was flushed with righteous anger, flanked by 4 of Willow Creek's most influential men, the butcher, the blacksmith, and 2 farmers whose judgmental stares had once cut deeper than any knife. "We've come for what belongs to us, Mountain Man," Robert called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "The woman has debts to pay to our community. Her punishment wasn't complete." John stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching men and the cabin. The morning light caught his silhouette, making him appear larger than life against the backdrop of his mountain home. He didn't reach for any weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone created an invisible boundary that none of the men seemed eager to cross. "Mary Johnson doesn't belong to anyone," John replied, each word measured and calm, despite the tension crackling in the air. "Not to you, not to your town, not even to me." Robert took another step forward, his confidence faltering slightly when John didn't back down. "The law. There's no law up here except what's right," John interrupted, his voice low and steady as the mountain stone beneath their feet. "She's not yours to claim. She never was." The men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. They had expected resistance, perhaps even violence, but not this quiet, immovable certainty. John's stance made it clear to reach Mary, they would have to go through him first. From her vantage point, Mary could see the doubt creeping across their face. These men, so powerful in the confines of Willow Creek, seemed diminished against the vastness of the mountain and the unwavering resolve of the man who called it home. "She's not yours to claim," John repeated, planting his feet more firmly, "and she never will be again." Robert Davis and his men stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, their confidence evaporating under John Brown's unwavering gaze. The mountain man hadn't drawn a weapon or raised his voice, yet his presence commanded more authority than any show of force could have. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held the wild, uncompromising spirit of the mountains themselves. "She's made her choice," John said, his voice carrying across the clearing like a low rumble of thunder. "This ends now." One of the men, a burly farmer with reddened knuckles, took a half-step forward, then faltered. Another muttered something about town law and proper order, but the words died in the mountain air. Robert's jaw clenched as he stared at the cabin behind John, knowing Mary was inside, just beyond his reach. "You can't hide her forever," Robert finally spat, his voice betraying the tremor beneath his bravado. "She belongs back in Willow Creek, where she can learn her place." John didn't blink. "No person belongs to another," he replied, planting his feet more firmly in the soil. "Not to you, not to that town." The invisible boundary between them seemed to solidify with each passing second. The men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. They had expected to find a frightened woman, not this mountain sentinel whose resolve matched the ancient pines surrounding them. From behind the cabin window, Mary watched the confrontation unfold, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see Robert's familiar stance, shoulders squared, chin jutting forward in that way that had always preceded his coldest judgments. But for the first time his posture seemed small against the backdrop of the wilderness. When the men finally turned away, their shoulders slumped in defeat, Mary felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. It wasn't just relief, it was triumph. The same men who had watched her chained to the oak tree, who had passed judgment without mercy, were now retreating down the mountain trail, their threats dissolving into the forest air. "They'll be back," John said quietly when he returned to the cabin, hanging his worn hat on a peg by the door. Mary nodded, still watching through the window as the last figure disappeared among the trees. "I know," she whispered, "but they didn't take me." The simple truth of those words filled the small cabin. She hadn't been taken. She hadn't surrendered. For a woman who had been treated as property to be judged and discarded, this small victory felt monumental. John busied himself with the fire, adding another log to the flames. "You stood your ground without even stepping outside," he observed, a rare hint of admiration in his voice. Mary turned from the window, a new resolve settling in her bones. "Next time," she said, "I won't be watching from inside." Mary's past refused to loosen its grip in the days that followed. The morning fog had barely lifted when a young boy, no more than 12, appeared at the cabin's edge. His eyes darted nervously between Mary and John Brown, who stood chopping wood nearby. The child thrust a folded paper toward her before scampering back down the mountain trail like a frightened rabbit. "From Robert," the boy called over his shoulder, his voice thin with fear. Mary Johnson stared at the letter, her fingers trembling as they traced the familiar handwriting. John set his axe down and moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring without being intrusive. "You don't have to read it," he said quietly. "I do," she whispered, breaking the wax seal. Robert Davis's words flowed across the page with calculated precision. He wrote of forgiveness, his forgiveness, as if she were the one who had committed some grievous sin. He spoke of her return to reason, and how the town would welcome her back if she would simply admit her failings and resume her proper place. The final lines promised that he would overlook her indiscretion with the mountain man if she came home immediately. Mary felt the old knot of guilt tightening in her chest, a physical ache that had once been as familiar as breathing. 6 weeks ago, these words would have crushed her, would have sent her stumbling back to Willow Creek with her head bowed in shame. But something fundamental had shifted within her. The mountain air had cleared more than just her lungs, it had cleared her vision. As she read Robert's carefully crafted manipulations, she recognized them for what they were, not truth, but tools of control. "He wants me back," she said, looking up at John. "He says he'll forgive me." The mountain man's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a question. "And what do you think of his offer?" he asked. Mary looked down at the paper, then at her hands, hands that had learned to build fires, to identify healing plants, to create rather than simply serve, hands that belonged to her alone. "I think," she said slowly, "that I don't need his forgiveness." The realization washed over her like spring rain, cleansing and cool. For the first time, she no longer saw herself through their eyes, through Robert's eyes. The shame that had been her constant companion began to loosen its hold. "I don't belong there anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to John. Mary Johnson held Robert's letter with trembling fingers, the paper's edge crumpling under her grip. The familiar handwriting brought back a flood of memories, the public humiliation at the oak tree, the cold stares, the whispers that followed her through Willow Creek. Her ex-husband's words promised forgiveness, a return to her former life, if only she would come back and accept her place. John Brown stood by the cabin window, his weathered face illuminated by the afternoon light. He said nothing, but his presence was steadying, a silent reminder that she had choices now. "He wants me back," Mary said, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Says the town will forgive me if I return and accept my failure." The last words caught in her throat. The mountain man's eyes met hers. "What do you want?" Such a simple question, yet no one had ever asked her that before. In Willow Creek, a woman's desires were secondary, especially a woman who couldn't fulfill her purpose of bearing children. Mary approached the fireplace, the letter heavy in her hand. The flames danced, orange and gold, consuming the logs with hungry persistence. She thought of Sarah Miller, the woman from John's journal, who never found her escape. She thought of the days chained to the oak, exposed to judgment and shame. With sudden resolve, Mary tossed the letter into the fire. The paper curled instantly, Robert's carefully penned promises blackening and dissolving into ash. "I don't belong there anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to John. The flames devoured her past, crackling with the sound of finality. John nodded once, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. The cabin seemed to exhale around them, as if the very air was breathing with her. Mary felt the weight of expectation fall away, replaced by something unfamiliar yet powerful, the certainty of her own choice. She moved to the small table where wild herbs dried in bundles, running her fingers over the plants she'd learned to identify and harvest. Each leaf represented knowledge earned, not given. Each root and stem was proof that she could sustain herself without Willow Creek's approval. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice stronger now, "I want to learn how to set traps for rabbits." John raised an eyebrow, surprised by her request, but pleased by her determination. "We'll start at dawn," he replied. That night, as darkness settled over the mountain, Mary slept without nightmares for the first time since her rescue. She had chosen freedom, and the weight of that choice gave her new strength. A strength that belonged to her alone. The tranquility of mountain life had lulled Mary Johnson into a false sense of security. For several weeks, she had breathed the clean air, learned to track deer through the underbrush, and slept without nightmare. But Willow Creek wasn't finished with her. The town's pride had been wounded by her escape. One crisp morning, as Mary gathered kindling near the stream, she noticed unusual tracks in the soft earth. They weren't John's familiar boot prints, nor the delicate impressions of deer or rabbit. These belonged to a stranger. "Someone's been watching the cabin," she told John Brown when she returned, her arms full of broken branches, the tracks circle around back. The mountain man nodded, his weathered face betraying no surprise. "I've felt eyes on us for 2 days now." He placed his hunting knife on the table between them. "Stay inside. Bar the door after I leave." As dusk settled over the trees, a figure emerged from the shadows, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and a determined stride. Mary watched from the window as he surveyed the clearing, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. This was no curious traveler or lost hunter. This was a bounty hunter, sent to drag her back to shame and punishment. John had anticipated this. He'd left obvious tracks leading away from the cabin, drawing the stranger deeper into the forest. The bounty hunter followed the trail like a bloodhound, moving with practiced stealth through the underbrush. What he didn't know was that John had lived in these woods for years. Every tree, every hollow, every patch of treacherous ground was familiar to him. The mountain man circled behind the hunter, becoming the predator rather than the prey. Beneath the ancient pines where the forest floor was carpeted with needles that muffled sound, John stepped into the open. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice low but carrying in the still air. The bounty hunter spun around, reaching for his weapon. "I've got business with the woman. Robert Davis paid good money to bring her back where she belongs." "She belongs where she chooses," John replied, his stance wide and ready. "Turn around. Go back to Willow Creek." The hunter laughed. "And if I don't?" What followed was swift and decisive. John moved with the surety of a man defending his home. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. Years of mountain living had made him stronger than any town-dwelling enforcer. When it was over, the bounty hunter lay on his side, wrists bound with his own belt, a gag fashioned from his bandana. He would live, but he would carry the message back to Willow Creek. Mary Johnson was not for taking. John Brown moved through the forest like a shadow, his footsteps barely disturbing the fallen pine needles. The bounty hunter followed the false trail, unaware he was being led deeper into the mountain's embrace. This man represented everything John despised, someone who treated people as property to be claimed and returned for coin. The mountain man circled back, watching his prey from behind a massive oak. The hunter was experienced. That much was clear from his methodical movements and the way his eyes constantly scanned the surrounding. A holstered weapon hung at his side, and his weathered face spoke of years spent tracking people who didn't want to be found. When the moment was right, John stepped into view. "You're looking for someone who doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice as steady as the mountain itself. As the bounty hunter's hand moved toward his weapon. "I'm not here for trouble, just the woman. There's good money waiting. She has a name, Mary Johnson, and she's not for sale." What followed wasn't a fight so much as a brutal dance. The hunter lunged with a knife, but John had anticipated this. He dodged the blade, using the man's momentum against him. His fist connected with the hunter's jaw once, twice, each blow calculated and precise. John had learned long ago that violence was sometimes necessary to protect what mattered. The bounty hunter fought back with the desperation of a cornered animal. He landed a solid punch to John's ribs, drawing a grunt of pain. But John had endured worse from the mountain winters. He weathered the blows, waiting for his opening. It came when the hunter stumbled on a root. John seized the moment, tackling him to the ground. They rolled through the underbrush, disturbing a flock of birds that scattered skyward. The struggle ended with John pinning the man against the earth. One knee pressed firmly into his chest. Using the hunter's own rope, John bound his wrists and ankles, then secured him to a sturdy pine. He checked the bindings tight enough to hold, not enough to harm. "She chose freedom," John said, breathing heavily. "That choice wasn't yours to take." From his pocket he pulled a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. His handwriting was rough, but clear. "You cannot control what was never yours." He pinned the note to the man's jacket with a small thorn. The bounty hunter spat blood onto the forest floor. "They'll send others." John looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "And they'll find the same welcome." He turned away, leaving the man where others would find him eventually. As he walked back toward the cabin where Mary waited, John felt a strange. Some battles were worth fighting, especially those for someone's soul. News of the bounty hunter's defeat spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. The town square, once the site of Mary Johnson's humiliation, now buzzed with conflicting whispers. Some residents huddled near the old oak tree, their faces twisted with indignation as they declared John Brown a dangerous outlaw who had stolen another man's wife. "That mountain hermit has no respect for our traditions," muttered one of Robert Davis's friends, pounding his fist against the wooden bench. "He should be brought to justice for interfering in our affair." Robert himself maintained a stony silence in public, though his eyes burned with quiet rage whenever the mountain man's name was mentioned. His pride had been wounded twice now, first by Mary's supposed failure as a wife, and now by John's defiance of the town's authority. Yet not everyone shared this outrage. In kitchens and back gardens, away from judging eyes, different conversations were taking place. Women who had witnessed Mary's punishment began to question what they had seen and their own complicity in it. "She stood there for 3 days, whispered Sarah Thompson, a baker's wife, as she kneaded dough with unusual force. "And we all just walked past her." These whispers grew bolder as days passed. In Emma Wilson's sewing circle, needles paused mid-stitch when someone dared to ask, what if it wasn't her fault? What if she couldn't bear children? The women exchanged glances, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. Many of them had lived under the same shadow of fear, that their worth was measured only by their ability to produce children. They began meeting in secret, gathering in the back room of the general store after hours or in remote clearings at the edge of town. Their voices, initially trembling with uncertainty, grew stronger with each meeting. "Mary isn't the failure they made her out to be," declared Emma during one such gathering. "She had the courage to survive what they did to her, and then to leave." The women nodded, a new resolve forming in their hearts. They had watched Mary transform from victim to symbol, from outcast to inspiration. Her escape represented something they had barely allowed themselves to imagine, the possibility of freedom from judgment and predetermined roles. As autumn winds swept through Willow Creek, these quiet rebellions took root. The town that had once stood united in condemnation now found itself divided between those who clung to the old ways and those who dared to question them. And high above them all, unaware of the change she had sparked, Mary continued to heal on the mountain, her very absence becoming a powerful presence in the town she had left behind. The sound of footsteps crunching through fallen leaves alerted Mary Johnson to visitors approaching the cabin. She stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun, and spotted 5 women making their way up the mountain trail. Their faces were familiar, women from Willow Creek who had once averted their eyes as she stood bound to the oak. "They've come for you," John said quietly, appearing at her side like a shadow. Mary nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. The women approached cautiously, like deer expecting a hunter's trap. Their leader, Emma, baker's wife who had once been Mary's neighbor, stepped forward. "We've been watching," Emma said, her voice trembling. "The way you live up here, the way you survived." Another woman, her eyes downcast, whispered, "Robert beat his new wife yesterday, just like he did to you. Nothing's changed down there." The women gathered closer, forming a hesitant circle around Mary. Their faces reflected a mixture of desperation and hope that made her throat tighten. "Teach us," they pleaded, eyes wide with fear and determination. "Show us how to live without chains." Mary glanced at John, who gave an almost imperceptible nod before retreating to the edge of the clearing, giving them space while remaining watchful. "I'm not special," Mary told them, leading the group toward her garden. "I just learned that my worth isn't measured by what men think of me." For hours Mary shared everything she had learned on the mountain. She showed them how to identify edible plants, how to cultivate the stubborn mountain soil, and how to build a fire that would burn even in damp conditions. But more important than these practical skills were the lessons of independence. Stand straight when they try to make you small, she instructed, correcting a young woman's hunched posture. Look them in the eye when they speak to you. As the sun began its descent, Mary led them to the edge of the clearing where they could see Willow Creek below. Tiny and insignificant from this height. The hardest part isn't learning to survive, she told them, her voice carrying on the mountain breeze. It's unlearning the belief that you deserve to suffer. The women listened, their expressions transforming from fear to something stronger. Mary recognized the change. It was the same awakening she had experienced months ago. Before they departed, Emma pressed something into Mary's palm, a small carved wooden bird. For freedom, she whispered. Mary watched them descend, 5 women walking taller than when they had arrived. Her pain had become their map, her scars their guide to a different future. And in their awakening she found another piece of her own healing. The thaw came gradually to the mountain, snow retreating inch by inch, as spring reclaimed the land. Mary Johnson watched the transformation from the cabin porch, noting how the world renewed itself without permission or apology. Like the mountain, she too had changed with the seasons. One morning John spotted them from the ridge, a group of men from Willow Creek, making their way up the trail. Unlike before, they carried no weapons, their postures lacking the rigid righteousness that had marked their previous visit. "They're back," John said simply, his weathered face revealing nothing. Mary nodded. "I know." Robert Davis led the group, his once proud shoulders now slightly stooped. The men gathered at the clearing's edge, hats in hands, eyes downcast, a tableau of uncertainty. Mary stepped forward, John a protective shadow behind her. "We've come to talk," Robert said, his voice stripped of its former authority. "Things are different in town now." The wind rustled through the new leaves as Mary studied her former husband's face. She could see the cost of his pride etched in new lines around his eyes. "The women," another man explained. "They've been meeting, talking. Some have left their homes." He shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing works right anymore." Mary felt no triumph at their discomfort, only a quiet recognition of inevitable change. "And what do you want from me?" "Understanding," Robert replied. "Maybe forgiveness, though we don't deserve it." She noticed how he avoided her gaze. This man who once believed he owned her future. The town's judgment had been absolute, but now that same certainty was crumbling beneath them. "We were wrong," a third man admitted, the words clearly difficult. "The old ways, they're breaking down." Mary considered their request, feeling the weight of John's presence behind her. She thought of the women who had climbed the mountain seeking guidance, their courage far greater than the men now standing before her. "Change doesn't come from understanding alone," she finally said. "It comes from action." Robert nodded slowly. "We know. That's why we're here." Mary saw the truth then. Willow Creek wasn't transforming out of sudden compassion or moral awakening. It was changing because it had to, because the women had found their voices and the old order could no longer sustain itself. "I don't have forgiveness to give you today," she told them honestly, "but I'm willing to listen." As the men spoke of the town's slow, painful evolution, Mary recognized that this fragile new reality wasn't built on love or even justice, but perhaps it was the necessary first step toward something better. Mary Johnson stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the sunrise paint the mountain in gold, no longer defined by chains or judgment. She had claimed this land as her own, not through ownership, but through the quiet authority of belonging. "The herbs need tending," John called from the garden they'd built together. His hands, once used only for survival, now nurtured life from the soil with surprising gentleness. The mountain man had changed too, his isolation softened by shared meals and evening conversation. They had built a rhythm together, these two survivors, mornings spent gathering and growing, afternoons teaching those who made the journey up the winding trail. Women from Willow Creek and neighboring towns arrived with questions in their eyes and left with seeds in their pockets and new strength in their spines. "Sarah would have loved this place," John said one evening, his voice low as he stirred the ember. It was the first time he'd spoken his lost love's name without pain shadowing his features. Mary squeezed his hand, understanding how healing happened in layers, like sediment forming new ground beneath their feet. Their cabin had expanded, a new room for healing herbs, another for visitors who needed shelter. What had begun as exile had transformed into sanctuary. The mountain air carried laughter now, something neither of them had thought possible in those early days. Robert had come once more months ago, standing awkwardly at the edge of their clearing. The town's different now, he'd said, hat in hands. Mary had offered him water, but not forgiveness. That wasn't hers to give away so easily. The man had left understanding that some bridges remain crossed but never rebuilt. 3 seasons had passed since Mary's liberation from the oak tree. Her wrists no longer bore marks, though sometimes she still rubbed them in her sleep. John would wake her gently, offering tea made from mountain herbs, his presence a quiet reminder that nightmares held no power in daylight. They weren't lovers, but something rarer, 2 souls who had recognized in each other the same hunger for freedom, the same capacity for growth. Their partnership was built on respect rather than need, choice rather than obligation. On clear evenings they sat watching the lights of Willow Creek below, no longer a place of fear but simply a collection of distant stars. Mary had become a healer not just of bodies but of spirits, teaching others to find strength in their scars rather than shame. "We've made something good here," she said, her voice steady with the certainty that comes from building your own salvation. John nodded, his eyes reflecting the setting sun, something free. The seasons had turned twice since Mary Johnson first arrived on the mountain, her body broken but her spirit finding its first tendrils of strength. Now as she stood on the edge of the clearing watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of amber and gold, she realized her greatest triumph wasn't simply escaping Willow Creek. It was becoming someone entirely new. The chains that once bound her to the oak in the town square had left scars on her wrists, but they had also forged in her a resolve harder than mountain stone. Mary had transformed those painful memories into wisdom, those tears into teaching. The garden she tended beside John's cabin, now their shared home, flourished with herbs and vegetables, a living testament to her newfound ability to nurture life in her own way. John watched her from the cabin doorway, his weathered face softened by something that might have been pride. The mountain man rarely spoke of the past anymore, of Sarah or the pain that had driven him to solitude. Instead, he focused on building this new life alongside Mary, finding healing in their shared strength. "The women are coming today," Mary said, turning to him with a smile that reached her eyes, something that had once seemed impossible. Twice each month, women from Willow Creek and beyond made the journey up the mountain path, seeking what Mary had found: freedom, purpose, dignity. Some came with bruises hidden beneath their sleeves. Others came with invisible wounds, inflicted by words and expectations. All left standing taller. Even Robert had changed. The last time he'd ventured up the mountain, it wasn't with threats or demands, but with an awkward offering of apology. Mary had accepted it with grace, not for his sake, but for her own peace. She no longer needed his validation or forgiveness. She had forgiven herself. The mountain, once her refuge from cruelty, had become the foundation of her purpose. In its soil she had planted not just seeds, but possibilities. In its air, she breathed not just survival but joy. As the morning light strengthened, Mary heard the distant sounds of voices and footsteps, the first of today's visitors making their way up the trail. She straightened her shoulders, ready to share what she had learned, that freedom isn't merely the absence of chains but the courage to forge a new path. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying her laughter down to Willow Creek, a town forever changed by one woman who refused to be defined by her pain. Mary Johnson had claimed her worth, not as something given by others but as her birthright, and in doing so she had become exactly who she was always meant to be.